Michael Walzer. Chapter 9. The Taking of Human Life 160. Listen to the chapter audio on mythinkingslab.com. Some of the basic arguments for and against the taking of human life in certain instances, e.g., suicide and war, will be examined in this chapter and the next two, and some cases will be laid out for readers to try to solve through their own ethical systems, considering the problems and issues that must be faced. Also, if instructors and students are interested, there is a special appendix for each chapter that explains how humanitarian ethics, the system proposed by Jacques Thirax in Chapter 8, would attempt to solve the problems being presented. In this way, readers are not subjected, unless they want to be, to Thirax's system of dealing with moral issues but will still have the moral issues presented to them as such. If they wish, however, they may use the humanitarian ethics solutions for critical discussion and evaluation. The humanitarian ethics discussion for this chapter may be found in Appendix 1, for the next chapter in Appendix 2, and so on. Objectives. After you have read this chapter, you should be able to 1. Understand further the importance of having basic principles, rules, or guidelines on which to base an approach to dealing with moral issues. 2. Show how basic principles can be applied to the general and significant problem of the taking of human life. 3. Show how basic principles are used to deal with the specific moral problems of suicide, defense of the innocent, war, terrorism, and capital punishment. And know the arguments for and against these issues. The taking of human life. One of the worst possible moral offenses that a human being can commit is the taking of another human's life. As stated earlier, the value of life principle is empirically the most important of the 5, inasmuch as morality itself depends on it. Therefore, one must revere life and accept death. Does this mean that human life may never be taken? We will examine different types of situations involving the taking of human life and see how basic principles can be applied to them. Suicide. Definitions of suicide. Chapter 5 presented definitions of killing and murder. To reiterate, killing means to put to death, slay, deprive of life, whereas murder means the unlawful killing of one human being by another, especially with malice aforethought. Suicide is defined in the same dictionary as an intentional taking of one's own life. Under this definition, the act of suicide certainly involves both killing and the taking of a human life, but it is extremely difficult to justify the argument that it involves murder. Furthermore, suicide is not generally considered civilly or criminally unlawful in most states and countries because it involves the taking of one's own life, not the life of another. It is a decision made by people about their own lives based upon their own thoughts and feelings. Arguments against the morality of suicide. The irrationality of suicide. One of the most common arguments against the morality of suicide is the one that suggests that all people who attempt or commit suicide are irrational or mentally or emotionally disturbed. A viewpoint characterized by the statement no one in his right mind would commit suicide. This argument further states that because suicide is never a rational act, it can never be considered as anything but immoral. The problem with this assumption is that it is too all-encompassing, as are the theories of psychological egoism, see Chapter 2, and hard determinism, see Chapter 6. How can a person who maintains this point of view prove that all people who attempt or commit suicide are irrational when they perform these acts? It certainly would be empirically true to say that some people have been driven by a mental imbalance to attempt or commit suicide. Evidence for this exists both in suicide notes and in the explanations of those who have failed in their attempts. However, there is also some evidence to suggest that many suicide attempts and suicides are carefully thought out and rationally decided upon. Many people who intend to commit suicide often leave calm, well-written letters explaining why they decided to commit suicide. It also has been noticed, by many of the families after the suicide has occurred, that there was calm and contentment just before the person committed suicide. In fact, families are often surprised, given the fact that the suicidal person was emotionally and mentally troubled and upset for most of his or her life, that just before he or she committed suicide that person seems to have been at peace. This might suggest that the suicidal person had found what he or she deems a rational way of solving his or her problems. Is this so irrational even if one does believe suicide to be wrong? In another example, Socrates, who was condemned to death by his peers, was urged to escape and had every opportunity to do so. Instead, he chose to drink hemlock, gay poison. Before he committed this act, he rationally discussed his decision with his students and friends, a conversation dramatized in Plato's dialogue Crito. Anyone who reads this dialogue will be hard put to say that Socrates was irrational in any sense of the word. One may not agree with Socrates' arguments or with his final decision, but it would be difficult to question the soundness of his mind. In any case, the argument that suicide is an irrational act, though sometimes valid, cannot be used to declare all suicides immoral, for it cannot be proven to be true in all cases. The religious argument. Various religions are opposed to suicide because they believe that only God has the authority to give and take away life. Human beings are only loaned their lives to be lived as well, morally and religiously, as they can. Religions certainly are entitled to this belief, and they may require that their members adhere to it. Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life 161, 162 Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life. By not committing suicide, but in no way can this view be imposed upon non-members, religious or non-religious, without some violation of the principles of freedom and justice. Furthermore, there are real problems with this view of God and life, whether one is religious or not, and they are carefully pointed out by Daniel Callahan in his book Abortion Law, Choice and Morality. This view presupposes that God intervenes directly in natural and human affairs as the primary causative agent of life and death. Not only is this theologically dubious, it also has the effect of obscuring the necessity that human beings define terms, make decisions and take responsibility for the direct care of human life. Moreover, to say that God is the ultimate source of the right to life, which is less objectionable theologically, still does not solve the problem of how human beings ought to respect that right or how they are to balance a conflict of rights. 2. This theological problem applies to all aspects of the taking of human life, not just suicide. Therefore, it would be good to keep this problem in mind as we deal with the other issues in this area. The domino argument. People who hold to the domino argument believe that if you allow human life to be taken in some instances, you open the door to its being taken in other instances and, eventually, in all instances. Like the religious argument, the domino argument also applies to areas of the taking of human life other than suicide. Furthermore, it is a good argument to be aware of when we are discussing any moral issue, because it forces us to be concerned about the effects of our moral decisions or laws. For example, if we argue that suicide is moral, then we should be concerned with where this will lead us. Will murder be made moral next? Or if suicide is morally permitted, then why not mercy killing and abortion? Even though it is important for us to try to gauge the effects of our rules and actions, where there is no definite or conclusive proof that one thing necessarily leads to another, we cannot use this argument as the sole reason for not allowing an act or person to be declared moral or immoral. And there is no conclusive proof that if suicide is allowed, murder soon will be allowed as well. Most states and countries have laws against capital punishment, abortion, mercy killing, and of course, murder. The justice argument. Probably the most effective case against the morality of suicide is made by those who argue that the people who survive a person who has committed suicide pay an unjust penalty. A husband or wife may leave behind a despondent and destitute spouse and grief-stricken children. Sons and daughters may leave guilt-ridden parents. Society may be denied the important contributions that could have been made by the person who committed suicide. This is an argument that must be carefully considered, for it involves the principle of justice, which, in the matter of suicide, conflicts with the principle of individual freedom. This is a conflict that must be dealt with as one attempts to decide whether suicide is moral. Argument for the morality of suicide. The basic argument in favor of suicide as a moral act has to do with a person's rights over his or her own body and life. It is also concerned with the freedom of a person to make decisions affecting his or her own body and life. Life is important, but to whom? Mostly to the person to whom it belongs, of course. Because suicide is an individual decision made by a person about his or her own life, it cannot be described as taking a life against. Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life 163. A person's will. Therefore it does not fully violate the value of life principle except in the sense that one ought to think carefully about the importance of life before one commits the act. When individuals decide that they would rather die than live, however, no one else, according to this argument, has the right to tell them otherwise. The principle of individual freedom is important here, of course, and so is the principle of goodness. Suicide is such a private act that only the person who is considering it can know to any degree whether continuing to live would bring her more satisfaction, excellence, or harmony than ending her life. This argument stresses that individuals are unique and that only they know whether or not their lives are worth living. Therefore, only they should be able to make decisions concerning whether they live or die. According to this argument, a decision to commit suicide may be considered rational, provided that a person's reasoning faculties are not impaired by severe mental or emotional disturbances. Even when they are in perfect mental health, however, people who successfully commit suicide should not be blamed for being immoral, nor should people who attempt suicide be blamed or punished in any way. The main criticism of this argument, other than those presented in the arguments against suicide we have already discussed, is that it tends to imply that people have absolute rights over their own bodies and lives. In other words, it suggests that the principle of individual freedom has no limitations, an implication that can raise some difficult problems. For example, if a man has a highly contagious disease and doesn't want to be placed in quarantine because it will limit his freedom over his own body and life, his freedom must nevertheless be restricted, otherwise, he could be responsible for the sickness and death of many other innocent people. That is, because of the priority of the first four basic principles, his freedom to do what he wants with his body and his life must be curtailed. In a similar manner, when a person's contemplated suicide will definitely affect the lives and welfare of others, e.g., his dependents, questions must at least be raised concerning the possible limits of the person's freedom over his own body and life. Case 1 Terminal cancer. William, 60, has had inoperable cancer for several months, and it is now in the terminal stages. He is unwilling to go to a hospital or a hospice and lives unhappily at home. Everything about living has lost its savor. He no longer enjoys eating, drinking, smoking, or any of his other former pleasures. He has made a will and taken care of all unfinished business. Finally, he confronts his wife and 2 teenage children with his wish to commit suicide to die with dignity, as he expresses it, rather than linger on and become increasingly ill. His wife and children don't like the idea, but they agree with him that the choice is his. He shoots himself and dies. Case 2 Teenage suicide. Joan, 18, has lived in one foster home after another ever since she was born. She has been in and out of mental institutions, having been treated for extreme depression. She has used drugs but is not using them now. Having become pregnant twice, she has had 2 abortions. She feels she has no real friends, she has no parents to relate to, and she can't concentrate on school or work. Although she has talked to several psychiatrists and psychologists, she doesn't feel any better about herself or her life. She finally decides, calmly, that she is tired of living. She takes an overdose of barbiturates without leaving a suicide note or telling anybody what she is going to do, and dies. 164 Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life. Generally speaking, neither the arguments for nor those against the morality of suicide advocate the taking of one's own life, and most people on either side probably would urge the use of all possible means to prevent people from killing themselves. The side supporting the morality of suicide, however, probably would allow for greater freedom for individual decision-making. For example, those who feel suicide is always immoral might advocate the imposition of physical and legal restraints upon people who are known to be suicidal, whereas people who believe that suicide can be a moral act will try to prevent people from committing suicide but will not use force in attempting to deny them the freedom to make their own rational decisions. The matter of assisted suicide will be discussed in the next chapter. Defense of the innocent, the self included. Argument against killing in defense of the innocent. There is really only one argument against killing in defense of the innocent, and that is based on the assumption held by the adherents of a few ethical systems, pacifists, Jainists, Kantian duty ethicists, that the taking of human life is always wrong. This position is the most consistent one possible in terms of the value of life principle because it respects human life at all costs. According to this argument, all human life is to be revered and no one may ever be killed for any reason, even if one's life is threatened by another. In such a case, one who is being threatened may try everything short of violence or killing to prevent being killed, but he or she may not kill another, even in self-defense or in defense of other innocent people. To refrain from killing any humans is, of course, an admirable ideal, and it is one to which most people are able to adhere throughout their lives. The main criticism of this point of view is that it does not take into consideration all the complexities of human existence, especially the fact that some humans, fortunately a relatively small number, do not respect the lives of others. If all humans would respect human life completely, then maybe everyone could completely adhere to the ideal of not killing other humans under any circumstances. This ideal certainly is put forth in Christianity and Jesus' teachings of love thy enemies and turn the other cheek. However, very few Christians or other human beings are willing to adhere to such an ideal. They simply do not feel that it is good, fair, or just for innocent people to lose their lives to killers who violate this ideal and who often cannot be stopped in any other way than by being killed themselves. Argument for killing in defense of the innocent. The argument for killing in defense of the innocent generally rests upon 2 assumptions. First, even though the value of life principle advocates a reverence for all human life, people have a right and, indeed, a moral obligation to protect any innocent lives, their own included, when it becomes clear that another human being no longer recognizes the value of other people's lives. Second, the good of defending the innocent far outweighs the bad of killing a person who is threatening to kill or who actually kills innocent people. The essence of this argument is that by threatening to kill or by killing others, killers in a sense forfeit their right to have their lives considered as valuable, especially when their acts cannot be stopped unless they themselves are killed. This argument qualifies the value of life principle by stating that one should never kill other humans except when defending innocent people, including oneself. The main criticism of this argument is that violence tends to breed more violence and that once the killing of humans has been allowed, even in defense of the cases for study and discussion, 9. Case 1 Burglar. Hearing a noise at the back of his house one afternoon, Ed picks up his loaded automatic pistol from a drawer in his desk and goes to investigate. He surprises an 18-year-old man in the act of going through his dresser drawers. The man has no weapons in his hands or in view. Ed asks what he is doing there, and the young man runs for the back door. Ed points the gun at his retreating back, fires 3 shots, and kills him. Is Ed morally justified in killing the young man? Case 2 Assault on woman. Mary, 22, returns home fairly late one evening from a party. As she enters her bedroom, a man jumps at her from behind the door, pins her down with one arm, and covers her mouth with the other. He wrestles her to her bed, and as she attempts to scream, he hits her several times in the face and on other parts of her body. She somehow manages to push him off the bed and onto the floor, and while he is recovering his equilibrium, she gets a loaded pistol out of the bedside table drawer. As the man stands up again, ready to lunge at Mary, she fires several shots and kills him. Is Mary's action justifiable? Case 3 Sniper. The scene is a crowded outdoor shopping mall that has a clock tower at its center. Rifle shots ring out from the tower and several people, including children, drop to the ground. 3 are seriously injured and 3 are killed. Police try for several hours to get the sniper to throw down his weapon and come out, but he continues to fire his rifle into store windows, into a nearby parking lot, and into a nearby street. One of the officers, a sharpshooter with a high-powered rifle, manages to maneuver himself into a position where he can get a perfect shot, but only at the sniper's head. He does so, killing the sniper instantly. Was the officer justified in killing the sniper? Innocent. No one knows where the violence will end. The domino argument again. The religious argument also applies here, adding the criticism that only God can create or take away life, and that, in his infinite wisdom, he will duly punish the killer in some way. Killing, in any case, is not the right of other humans under any circumstances. The religious argument is open to the same criticism as that presented in the discussion of suicide. War. Arguments against the morality of war. The Standard College Dictionary defines war as an armed conflict openly carried on between nations or states, or between different parties in the same state. The dictionary could have added, and in which people, many of them completely innocent, are killed, usually violently, because of the wholesale killing that almost inevitably accompanies any type of war except a so-called cold one. War is a powerful threat to the value of life principle and should be avoided by every human effort possible. The arguments against. Chapter 9. The taking of human life. 165. 166. Chapter 9. The taking of human life. War have increased during the 20th and 21st centuries because of our advanced military technology, especially the nuclear capability of various nations, which could lead to world destruction. The chances of a world war occurring seem to have diminished, and at least the larger nations have begun to see the futility of a nuclear war that would destroy everything and everybody. However, small wars, regional conflicts, and terrorism have increased in various parts of the world, and even though they do not involve nuclear weaponry, their destructiveness to life and the environment in each respective location is still unacceptable to peace-loving people and nations. Further, such small wars inevitably attract the involvement of the larger nations with nuclear capability, which makes any war a danger to world peace. The main argument against the morality of war is that it is a direct and massive violation of the value of life principle. War doesn't just involve the killing of one human being by another. Rather, it involves a mass killing of up to millions, depending upon the scale of the war. Furthermore, especially because of modern military techniques, war necessitates the useless killing of a great number of innocent non-combatants, many of them children. Those who take an anti-war stance maintain that, in the long run, so little is gained by war and yet so much is lost in terms of human life and human possessions that it has to be considered an immoral act. In fact, the most immoral act human beings can perform. This point of view was held widely during the Vietnam War era, when there was a tremendous rise in the number of conscientious objectors and outspoken pacifists. Pacifists have argued that war in all its aspects should be banned worldwide, and that violence and aggression should never be met with similar force but rather with non-violence and non-aggression. They would argue, for example, that every peaceful effort must be exerted to avert war, but that even if a country is invaded, its citizens should try to pacify their violent invaders rather than resort to violence. This extreme form of the anti-war argument is held by a minority of the world's population, even though it has grown in popularity because of the many destructive wars that have occurred since 1900. Many more people hold a moderate view, a general policy of non-aggression toward other people or countries. Arguments for the morality of war. Even though few people advocate war openly as a general solution to human problems, there are some traditional arguments in favor of war that should be examined. War is the best controller of overpopulation. The view that sees war as being the best controller of overpopulation is based upon the fact that the population of the world is increasing at a rate too rapid. Therefore, war, which effectively decreases the population, helps to solve this problem very efficiently. The argument is, of course, morally weak because alternate solutions are available, especially in our scientifically and technologically oriented society. In addition, one could argue effectively that the quality of population control achieved by war is very poor because it is the youth, the best hope of all societies, that generally suffer the greatest casualty rate. In any case, many countries have found alternate methods for reducing their populations without resorting to the destruction and decimation of war. War is the mother of invention. The argument has been advocated that war is the only way in which societies can develop and experiment with advanced technology. There is no doubt that many technological advances that were developed for military purposes have also been used in a peaceful way. Some of these advances are directly dependent upon war, for example, the development of advanced surgical techniques. Chapter 9. The taking of human life. 167. Prosthetic devices and plastic surgery techniques that occurred during the Korean War. These certainly could have been developed without war, but perhaps it would have taken much longer to do so. Obviously, one has to consider the price that must be paid for such invention. Furthermore, it is certainly true that technological development can occur without war, e.g., by means of the space development program. Even though peacetime development may be slower or more expensive, war is a boon to economic gain and national unity. Many argue that nothing unifies a people more than working together to achieve a national goal, such as winning a war. Furthermore, it is argued, such unification, which often involves the production of war machines and material, creates an upsurge in economic well-being and prosperity. This argument became particularly popular during and after World War II, especially in the United States. Nothing had ever unified the nation to the extent that the war effort did, and, despite wartime shortages, the nation achieved an economic prosperity that continued even after the war was over. The country mass-produced planes, tanks, weapons, and other material on a greater scale than ever before, and after the war, factories produced great numbers of peacetime goods, cars, homes, appliances which the entire population desired after 4 years of deprivation. After 2 more wars, however, the divisive aspects of war became obvious, and people began to recognize that the cost of achieving economic prosperity through war is too high. die. As a matter of fact, though not the only factor in our economic problems, waging our current war on terror is certainly a contributing factor to such problems and therefore not a boon to our economy. Since World War II, countries have been able to unify and achieve economic well-being without wartime production, and this fact encourages most people to seek alternative means of attaining these national goals. War is a necessary evil. The just war argument. Probably the most morally significant argument for war is that although war generally is immoral, there is such a thing as a morally just war under certain conditions. One example of such an argument can be found in Roman Catholic teachings. Before discussing this argument, it should be noted that this type of thinking has been applied essentially to non-nuclear warfare. Also, it would be incorrect to assume that this is the position presently held by the Roman Catholic Church. With these disclaimers in mind, the following conditions might be considered to describe a morally just war: that it shall be undertaken by the lawful authority, that it shall be undertaken for the vindication of an undoubted and proportionate right that has certainly been infringed, that it shall be a last resort, all peaceful means of settlement having been tried in vain, that the good to be achieved shall outweigh the evils that war will involve, that there shall be a reasonable hope of victory for justice. A war undertaken in face of certain failure is, however heroic, irrational, and therefore indefensible. There must be a right intention, that is, to right the wrong and not simply to maintain national prestige and influence or to enlarge territory. Territory is not a just cause of war, nor may war be waged as part of a scheme for converting the heathen to Christianity, and the methods of warfare must be legitimate, i.e., in accordance with international agreements, with our nature as rational beings and with the moral teachings of Christianity. 3. The Catholic Encyclopedia, from which this passage was taken, goes on to remark that there may be vagueness and uncertainty concerning any case of war being considered. 168 Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life. And of course there is a great deal of vagueness and ambiguity in the passage itself. It does, however, provide some guidelines that have a moral basis, that the reason for war must be serious enough to outweigh its evils, that it cannot be carried on for prestige, for territory, or to increase the influence of the nation waging it. The part about a war not being waged to convert heathens to Christianity should be expanded to include converting or punishing other religions, races, or nations for not believing in the aggressor's policies or religions, that all peaceful means of settlement must have been exhausted, and that a nation's methods, once war is declared, must be legitimate. Even such justifications, however, would seem to apply only to limited non-nuclear wars, because there is probably no political situation important enough to justify the possibility of setting off World War III and risking the total destruction of the human race and the world. The indefensibility of nuclear war. Even the arguments in support of a just war pale when one stops to consider the total devastation that could result from a nuclear war. This carries over to any defense of even limited wars, because there is always a possibility that one of these could set off a large-scale nuclear holocaust. Given the tendency toward violence of the human species in general, Homo sapiens is the only species that destroys itself. It is probably too much to hope for that wars of all kinds can ever be totally eliminated, although every effort should be made to do so now and in the future. Barring the success of such an effort, however, any small wars should be contained and not allowed to mushroom into the use of nuclear weapons, especially by those countries that have large arsenals of such weapons. None of the arguments in support of war, including the just war argument, can morally justify a nuclear holocaust. Terrorism. Terrorism is defined by Caleb Carr in his book The Lessons of Terror as the contemporary name given to, and the modern permutation of, warfare deliberately waged against civilians with the purpose of destroying their will to support either leaders or policies that the agents of such violence find objectionable. 4. Many people may think that terrorism is an activity that has been invented and practiced in the 20th and 21st centuries, but the purposeful targeting of civilians is as old as warfare itself, and terrorism is a type of military warfare practiced by every nation including the United States. Carr also refers to it as total, destructive, or punitive type of war. Terrorism can be traced back to Roman times, the Crusades in which Christians and Muslims employed it on each other. During the Indian and Civil Wars in the United States, the French Revolution, World Wars I and II, the Korean conflict, Vietnam, and the terrorist wars of Afghanistan and Iraq. Other modern-day terrorist attacks have occurred in Ireland and England, Israel and Palestine, the Oklahoma City Federal Building, the first bombing of the World Trade Center in New York, and, of course, the total destruction of the World Trade Center on September 11, 2001, in which over 3,000 people, mostly civilians, were killed and many injured. The main purpose of terrorism is to protest violently against some serious differences of opinion, ideologies, world events, or culture. Terrorists seem to think that the only protest that has any significance is to destroy small or large segments of civilians with the idea that they will not support the policies or ideologies of the country where the attacks take place. Carr, however, argues successfully that even though terrorism has, Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life 169, been practiced throughout history, it has continually been a failure because the civilians attacked in such a fashion have turned against and rejected their attackers. For example, in the case of September 11, 2001, attack, it, if anything, has hardened the resolve of the US government and its civilians against the terrorists. 5. It is important to note that terrorists are indeed soldiers who wage war, albeit a different kind of war, who have a financial base, excellent communications and intelligence, and, in the case of September 11 attacks, several sovereign countries to sponsor and support them in every way they need. One has to recognize, no matter how terrible the attack on September 11 was, the ingenuity of the attackers. They needed no missiles. They commandeered civilian planes filled with fuel and used them as missiles, requiring the terrorist crews to act as suicidal soldiers. Their intelligence was so far superior to ours that no one even suspected the attacks were to take place until they actually occurred. Argument in support of terrorism. Despite the fact that non-violent protest was put forth by Mahatma Gandhi in India and Martin Luther King Jr., in America, many organizations formed out of cultures and nations of angry people, many of these in the so-called third world countries, have come to feel that non-violent protests are ignored and ineffective at best and only get them killed by their oppressors at worst. Therefore, violent actions, such as bombing, the taking of hostages, and guerrilla attacks, are seen as being the only surefire ways of getting the powers that be to recognize them. Because these organizations feel that they will continue to be ignored, they have resorted to violence in order to bring attention to their causes. It's true that innocent people will die, but terrorists reason that no one not on the side of their cause is innocent, so they don't care. They feel they are in a war for their rights, freedom, culture, religion, or territory, and war means that people will die. Argument against terrorism. The main argument against terrorism is that excessive violence, especially where it involves the lives of innocent people, cannot be condoned. Terrorism, as its advocates state, is war, but undeclared war and certainly not war in defense of the innocent. As stated earlier, one can argue for just wars, dutifully declared and fought only for the defense of the innocent by the military of both sides. But the wide-ranging approach to violence that terrorism uses, in which innocent bystanders are murdered, is morally unjustifiable. People who are against terrorism terrorism argue that wrongs must be righted by reason, by negotiation, and in other peaceful ways. This may take longer, but it is safer for everyone concerned. Furthermore, terrorism usually does not aid the causes of its advocates because it prompts greater terrorism from the other side. Also, it tends to turn against its adherents all those who believe terrorism to be immoral. Therefore, according to those opposed to terrorism, it can never be justified. The semantics of terrorism and double standards. Terrorism is a type of violence and, since it is violence that intentionally targets the innocent, it is generally considered to be wrong and is universally condemned. As seen earlier, consequentialist arguments can be made in support of terrorism. But, because such arguments are essentially attempts to justify violence against the innocent, they are not rationally persuasive. In contrast, non-consequentialist theories, such as Kant's, would hold that terrorism denies the intrinsic worth of persons in that it treats persons solely as means and not as ends. 170 Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life. Igor Primoratz notes the following curious fact about the concept of terrorism: nobody applies the word to oneself and one's own actions, nor to those one has sympathy with or whose activities one supports. As the hackneyed cliché has it, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. 6 In other words, self-interest and partiality foster a double standard relative to the application of the term in the public debate about terrorism by creating an us versus them framework for discourse. The second double standard involves non-state actors, for example, insurgents, versus actors engaged in similar violence sanctioned by the political state. The term terrorism, almost as a matter of definition, is applied to insurgents and not to agents of the state, especially when it is one's own political state that is in question. Cases for study and discussion. Case 1: Invasion of smaller nation by larger nation. A small nation located on a seacoast has both the commercial ports and the natural resources that a larger neighboring inland nation needs. The larger nation negotiates for use of the ports and purchase of the resources, and an agreement is reached between the two nations that lasts for several years. Eventually, however, a new government that has come to power in the larger nation decides that it should not have to pay for natural resources so close to its own borders and that it should have complete control of the seaports it now uses. After a breakdown of new negotiations, the larger nation invades its smaller neighbor, and the smaller nation aggressively defends itself. Is the larger nation justified in starting a war, and is the smaller nation justified in defending itself? Case 2: Iraq War. To what extent does the U.S. invasion of Iraq fit with the Catholic description of a just war? To what extent do you think this invasion was justified at all under any circumstances? To what extent do you think this is a war of terrorism on both sides? Be specific. Case 3: Civil war in a small country with a large country's support. A small Far Eastern country that is rich in natural resources has suffered an ideological split. One half of the populace advocates communism as a form of government, whereas the other half advocates a democratic form. Two larger powers outside the country develop an interest in the struggle. Country A supports the communist faction, whereas country B supports the democratic faction. Both of the larger countries have vested interests in the Far Eastern country in the form of mines, factories, land, and financial investments. When the two factions in the small country declare war on each other over their differing ideologies in a struggle for control of the entire land, the two larger countries begin to support their respective sides by sending money, arms, supplies, and military advisors. As the democratic faction weakens and begins to lose the war, country B steps up its support by sending in elements of its own army, navy, and air force, committing itself to helping the democratic side by any means other than nuclear warfare. To what extent are the two factions in the Far Eastern country justified in entering into warfare against each other? And to what extent are the larger powers justified in supporting their respective sides? Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life. 171. It is important, therefore, as good critical thinkers and individuals trained in ethical reasoning, to be alert to the nuances of political rhetoric and to clarify our meaning of the word terrorism in order to develop well-reasoned arguments about whether it is morally acceptable. Furthermore, one would do well to understand the social, economic, political, and cultural conditions that give rise to and support terrorism, not to rationalize or legitimize terrorist acts but to eliminate, so far as possible, such conditions. Although certain conditions may help explain terrorism, such conditions cannot justify it. Capital punishment. A definition. As most dictionaries define it, capital punishment means the infliction of death for certain crimes. These crimes often are called capital crimes, and depending upon the society in question, they have varied from stealing to murder. For the most part, especially in the United States, capital punishment is usually applied for murder, especially premeditated murder or kidnapping with intent to do bodily harm or kill, and sometimes for instances of treason that endanger the lives of those living in a country. Theories of punishment. It would behoove readers to review Chapter 7 on reward and punishment, particularly its treatment of the three major theories as to when and why punishment should be meted out. As a quick reiteration, however, the theories are as follows. Retributive, Desert's theory. Punishment should be given only when it is deserved and only to the extent it is deserved. It should have no other goal than punishing people who deserve the punishment because of some immoral act that they have committed, and the punishment should fit the crime. Utilitarian results theory. Punishment always should have as its aim the good of society. If punishment will bring about good consequences for people, then it should be given. If it won't, then it shouldn't. It always should be given in order that some good can be done, for example, to deter future crime, to protect society, or to rehabilitate a criminal. Restitution, compensation theory. Justice is served only if the victims of a crime or offense are provided with restitution or compensation for the harm done to them. Capital punishment could conceivably be acceptable in all of the preceding theories, at least in some cases but not in others. For example, it certainly would fit the retributive theory, but only if the person to be punished truly deserved the punishment. Utilitarians also might approve of such punishment, but only if the greatest number of good consequences were to come about because of it. If the only compensation for murder, for example, was considered by restitutionists to be the execution of the murderer so as to satisfy and compensate the victim, then capital punishment might be deemed acceptable by them too. However, most restitutionists probably would consider that such punishment actually would thwart proper compensation of the victim because the criminal or offender no longer would be alive to work for the victim's benefit. For example, 172 Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life. Arguments against the morality of capital punishment. Violation of the value of life principle. Many argue against capital punishment on the grounds that it is a direct violation of the value of life principle. They maintain that capital punishment amounts to murder, social murder directed by society against one of its members. The argument further says that if taking human life is wrong in other instances, then it is also wrong in this instance. True, the argument continues, capital punishment can function as a form of societal retribution or revenge, but in a civilized society, this should not be deemed a sufficient motive for taking a human life. Effect on the criminal's victims or on society, because killing a criminal will not bring back his or her victims, or in any way compensate the survivors of the victims. There is really no purpose in taking the criminal's life other than to satisfy the society's need for revenge or the victim's need for retribution. This, according to the opponents of capital punishment, is not a civilized emotion. They feel that capital punishment encourages violence, acts of revenge or retribution, and murder in society at large because it leads to the rationale that if society can kill its members, then individuals also can take revenge into their own hands. Ineffectiveness as a deterrent. One of the most common arguments for capital punishment, as we shall see, is that it deters crimes throughout the society. Its opponents, however, argue that there is no conclusive evidence to support this claim. They point to history in support of their argument, stating that when capital punishment was used against thieves in England, pickpockets were operating throughout the crowds of watchers who gathered to see a thief hanged. They also question why, if this punishment works so well as a deterrent, executions by hangings, by firing squads, in gas chambers, and by lethal injection are not shown on television or performed in the streets, rather than being carried out in the relative privacy of our prisons. They argue further that killings occur even in prison, right outside the execution chamber. Therefore, they state, capital punishment does not serve as an effective deterrent. Executing an innocent person. Sometimes people accused of capital crimes are convicted on mainly circumstantial evidence, and therefore it is quite possible to execute an innocent person. If even one innocent person is executed, this argument continues, then capital punishment is a moral wrong. Furthermore, because rich people who are charged with capital crimes can afford better attorneys, the people most often convicted of capital crimes are poor people, often members of minority races, for example, African Americans, Hispanics, or Native Americans. This means that punishment by killing may be applied unequally to people who commit similar crimes. This is even a more prevalent problem with the introduction of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid testing or fingerprinting as it is often known. This testing, developed in the 20th century, has enabled forensic specialists to acquire a specimen from a person, e.g., saliva, blood, and semen, and match it with materials found at the scene of a crime or on a victim's body or clothes. This testing not only has helped to convict guilty people of crimes but also has helped find allegedly guilty people, who are often waiting on death row, innocent of crimes. In addition, other circumstances, such as the unreliability of so-called jailhouse informants, unqualified defense attorneys, and racism as described earlier, have resulted in the reversal of many capital crimes. The governor of Illinois recently halted executions in his state and declared a moratorium for all of the earlier mentioned reasons, saying, "Until I can be sure that everyone sentenced to death in Illinois is truly guilty, until I can be sure with moral certainty that no innocent man or woman is facing a lethal injection no one will meet." That fate 7 when his term was up, he pardoned all the prisoners on death row and gave them life imprisonment without parole. Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life 173. Denial of the chance for rehabilitation. The denial of the chance for rehabilitation argument states that nothing is accomplished by capital punishment other than the compounding of the badness already caused by the original crime. Instead of one human life being taken, capital punishment causes 2 to be taken. Wouldn't it be more valuable, opponents of capital punishment ask, for society to eliminate killing by reforming killers through education and other methods of rehabilitation? They argue further that most killers have been shaped by a corrupt society or a poor early environment, child-abusing parents, for example, and that if we could only re-educate them they could become useful members of society. Arguments for the morality of capital punishment. The effective deterrent argument. People who argue for capital punishment strongly disagree with those who state that it is not an effective deterrent. They argue, with irrefutable logic, that capital punishment deters the killer from killing again by terminating his life. They admit that the evidence for general deterrence may not be conclusive, but they strongly believe that many people are prevented from killing, or at least think twice about it, when they know that they may have to face the death penalty for their crime. According to capital punishment's supporters, the reason it isn't always an effective deterrent is that it isn't used enough. Many of its supporters are also in favor of making everyone watch the execution of legally convicted killers so that deterrence would be more effectively reinforced. The economic argument. There is no proof that murderers can be successfully rehabilitated, and sentences of life imprisonment seldom really mean life because many murderers are released from prison after 7 or 10 years. Some have been released and have killed again. With these facts in mind, supporters of capital punishment think that it is much too costly for innocent taxpayers to support killers in prison for long sentences or for life. Why, they ask, should innocent people pay for the continued support of criminals who have proved themselves unfit to live in society? The crimes they have committed are so terrible that there is no reason they should be allowed to live while innocent people pay for their upkeep. One criticism of this argument is that it costs more to give a criminal capital punishment than it does to give him or her life imprisonment without parole, given all of the appeals and court actions often gone through in the case of a criminal who has been sentenced to death. The main criticism of this argument, however, holds that when human life, even reprehensible human life, is at stake, a civilized society and humanity should not be concerned with monetary costs, even though it costs a great deal of money to keep criminals in prison, and even more of it when rehabilitation programs are implemented. Critics of the economic argument believe that it is more moral to try to make a human life useful than to terminate it, even though it is cheaper to execute prisoners than to rehabilitate them. Isn't it extremely dehumanizing, they ask, to argue that the maintenance and possible rehabilitation of human life is less important than mere financial cost? This issue will surface again when we discuss the cost of maintaining the lives of innocent people who are in terminal stages of illness. The effect upon society's laws. By having the option of applying the death penalty, some argue, we give strong sanction to the entire criminal law enforcement system. We put teeth into that system. For example, suppose a criminal is convicted of armed robbery, serves a term in prison, and then is released. The very existence of capital punishment reminds this person that if he or she returns to armed robbery and later kills someone while committing this second crime, the death penalty may be applied. 174 Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life. The sanction argument suggests that criminals will be deterred from escalating the nature of their crimes because of the death penalty threat, and that this in turn gives the entire criminal justice system strength. The threat of the death penalty may even encourage criminals to leave the armed out of armed robbery, thus minimizing the chance that an innocent person will be killed. The main criticism of this argument is that there are other, more humane ways of giving a system of law enforcement sanction. Highly effective legal systems have existed without capital punishment, England's, for example, and and there is no conclusive evidence that the existence of capital punishment has any deterrent effect on the thieves, embezzlers, rapists, and other criminals to whom the death penalty cannot usually be applied. Effective prosecution and just punishment would seem to be as, or more, effective in preventing crime as is maintaining the death penalty as a part of the system. The forfeiture of killers' rights. Another argument for capital punishment, in answer to the violation of the value of life argument, is that killers, having violated both morality and the law, have forfeited their right to be treated ethically. Just as you would kill a rabid dog or a wild animal who threatened the lives of innocent members of society, so too you should punish these killers. Some argue further that capital punishment is merely another form of self-defense, one that applies to the entire society. Just as individual people have the right to protect themselves against killers who threaten their lives, so society has the right to protect itself against anyone who has killed once by ensuring that he or she does not kill again. Prison, they argue, is not an adequate means of ensuring this, because killers can be paroled or can escape as some did in a Texas prison recently and others were murdered. Therefore, the argument continues, capital punishment is moral. It certainly would seem to be the case that people who have killed should forfeit some of their rights. The question is whether this forfeiture should include their very lives. Certain killers have proved themselves to be so dangerous as to forfeit their right to live freely among other innocent people, but does this mean that they must be killed? Furthermore, there are some cases in which killers have been paroled and have lived normal lives from that time on, even contributing something positive to society in the process. There are even cases in which criminals contribute something good to society while in prison. The uselessness of rehabilitation argument. In answer to the argument against capital punishment based on the inability to rehabilitate those who have been executed is the argument that rehabilitation, especially in the case of murderers, is useless and often impossible. How can serial or mutilating killers be rehabilitated? In the first place, no one can know for sure whether someone has been rehabilitated. Psychology and sociology are inexact sciences when it comes to this issue. Second, how is it possible to rehabilitate a Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, or Jeffrey Dahmer? These heinous killers are no better than societal mad dogs and should be put down, according to proponents of capital punishment. Also, the rate of recidivism, criminals returning to crime, is extremely high. Revenge. A final, classic argument for capital punishment is based upon the idea of revenge, or the eye for an eye concept of justice. This argument says that if people kill, they must forfeit their lives in order to balance the scales. This is an ancient concept, dating back to at least Old Testament times, and it often has been the basis for long-lasting feuds and vendettas between families, gangs, tribes, or other groups. For example, if the son of a chief of tribe A is killed by a member of tribe B, then the son of the chief of tribe B must be killed, and so on. Cases for study and discussion. Case 1, murder by 2 college students. As an intellectual game, 2 male college students, ages 18 and 19, attempt to commit the perfect crime by kidnapping a young boy and demanding ransom from his parents. They receive the ransom money but kill the boy anyway. Later, they are caught, tried, and convicted of murder and kidnapping with intent to do bodily harm. Their defense attorney, a brilliant lawyer, successfully argues against the death penalty and both men are sent to prison for life. After about 5 years, one of the men is killed in a fight, but the other completes his college education while still in prison and teaches other convicts English. He also volunteers for medical experiments, allowing himself to be injected with malaria germs in order to test new drugs. A model prisoner, he causes no trouble throughout his entire prison term. After about 30 years, he is paroled, whereupon he goes to a different country and continues to teach English. 2 years later he dies of natural causes. Should this man have been subjected to capital punishment? Why or why not? Case 2, man who kills is released from a mental institution kills again. A young man of 20 is guilty of killing both his grandparents and his mother. He is judged to be legally insane and is sent to a mental hospital for the criminally insane. After 3 years, he is judged to be cured of his mental illness and he is released as sane. 6 months later, however, he goes berserk and kills 6 young people in the mountain area where he now lives. What treatment or punishment should he receive? Case 3, rapist kidnapper. A 27-year-old man who has been a criminal most of his life is charged with attacking several young couples in a deserted area. Specifically, he is charged with beating the men and then raping the women after having transported them to a different area, thus technically kidnapping them. The man is convicted mainly on circumstantial evidence, and he continually denies that he is guilty. Although he is given the death penalty, he manages to stave off execution for 10 years. While in prison he studies psychology and law and learns a great deal about both. He analyzes how and why he turned to crime, and he writes and publishes several books about his life. He does not express remorse for his criminal activity, and he continues to deny that he is guilty of the last crime with which he was charged. After 10 years, he has exhausted all of his appeals and again is up for execution in the gas chamber. Should he be given the death penalty? Case 4, killer cannibalist. A man of 30 is discovered to have enticed boys and men to his apartment to have sex with them. In 15 of these encounters he killed them, had sex with their corpses, ate their flesh, and dismembered their bodies, keeping some body parts in the freezer and disposing of others in a vat of acid. When caught, he admitted to all of these actions. Though obviously bizarre and perverted, he was nevertheless considered to be legally sane, that is, as being able to distinguish right from wrong. What should be done with such a person? Explain in detail, providing reasons for your answer. Should he be executed? Why or why not? Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life 175. 176 Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life. This concept has been pretty much, although not entirely, discarded in more civilized societies because it leads to continuing killing and bloodshed and unnecessary loss of many lives. Another criticism is that this concept conflicts with the moral and legal view that 2 wrongs don't make a right. Most societies now feel that people who kill can be justly punished without being executed. Besides, as stated earlier, some convicted killers have in fact made positive contributions to society, either while in prison or on parole. Chapter summary. I. Applying the 5 basic moral principles to the taking of human life. A. It is questionable whether suicide, which is defined as an intentional taking of one's life, is moral or immoral. 1. There are several arguments against the morality of suicide. A. Some argue that suicide is always irrational. There is evidence, however, that although it is an irrational act in some cases, in others it is not. B. The religious argument states that only God can create or end life. 1. This applies only to members of a specific religion that states this as its belief. 2. It is theologically questionable. 3. It removes human responsibility with regard to protecting, preserving, or ending life. C. The domino argument states that if suicide is allowed, then other forms of murder will follow. 1. This argument is worthy of consideration. 2. There is, however, no conclusive evidence to support it. D. The justice argument questions whether suicide is fair to survivors of the victim. 2. There are also arguments for the morality of suicide. A. A person has rights over his or her own body and life. B. A person should have the freedom to make decisions concerning his or her own body and life. C. It is entirely up to individual human beings to decide whether their own lives are worth living. B. D. The main criticism of this argument is that no one has absolute rights over his or her own body or life. It is questionable whether killing someone in defense of the innocent, oneself included, is moral or immoral. 1. There is one main argument against the morality of such an act. A. The taking of human life is always wrong. B. The main criticism of this argument is that it doesn't recognize the complexities of human existence or that some humans are capable of violating all 5 basic principles. 2. There are arguments for the morality of killing in defense of the innocent. A. People have rights and obligations to protect innocent lives, their own included. B. The good of defending the innocent far outweighs the bad of killing a murderer of innocent people. C. The main criticism of these arguments is that violence breeds violence, the domino argument again. It is questionable if war is moral or immoral. 1. There are arguments against the morality of war. A. It is a direct and massive violation of value of life principle, especially when nuclear weapons are used. B. It causes a great deal of useless killing, especially of innocent non-combatants. C. The destruction caused by war far outweighs the gain. D. The solution is to deal with aggression and violence through peaceful means to pacify one's enemy through non-violence. C2. There are arguments for the morality of war. A. War is the best controller of overpopulation. B. It is the mother of invention. C. It is a great unifying factor and economic boon for individual nations. D. War sometimes is a necessary evil. The morally just war does exist. 1. Early Roman Catholic doctrine describes the possibility of just wars. 2. War is a more encompassing form of defense of the innocent. 3. Given the devastation possible in a nuclear war, most arguments, including the just war argument, cannot support a nuclear holocaust. Such a war is indefensible. 4. There is an old and very destructive method of making war, and that is terrorism. A. Terrorism is defined as war deliberately waged against civilians. B. One of the most difficult aspects of terrorism is the injury and death of hundreds of innocent people and the destruction of property. C. Argument in support of terrorism: when people are oppressed or angry about their lot in life, and non-violent means haven't worked for them, they feel they must resort to violence. Innocents may be killed, but the terrorist's cause is more important. D. Argument against terrorism: excessive violence, especially when it involves the loss or mutilation of the lives of innocent people, cannot be condoned. Terrorism does not fall under any definition of a morally just war. E. The semantics of terrorism in public discourse reveals 2 double standards: an us versus them mentality and a framework that condemns the actions of non-state actors and, at the same time, condones similar acts committed by agents of the state, especially one's own state. D. It is questionable whether capital punishment is moral or immoral. 1. Capital punishment is defined as punishment, usually by death, that is imposed in response to certain capital crimes such as murder, kidnapping, rape, and torture. Chapter 9. The taking of human life. 177. 2. Theories of punishment are as follows. A. Retributive or deserts theory: punishment should be given only when it is deserved, and to the extent it is deserved. B. Utilitarian or results theory: punishment is justified only if it will bring about good consequences for everyone. C. Restitution or compensation theory: justice is served only if the victim of a crime or offense is provided with restitution or compensation for the harm done to him or her. D. Capital punishment could conceivably be acceptable in all of the preceding theories in some cases but not in others. 3. There are arguments against the morality of capital punishment. A. It is a direct violation of the value of life principle: a murder planned and executed by society. B. It doesn't bring back the killer's dead victims or in any way, other than by expressing vengeance or recompense the survivors of the victim. C. There is no conclusive proof that it really acts as a deterrent, especially since most executions are performed in relative privacy. D. It is possible to wrongly execute an innocent person, and rich people who can afford good lawyers are less frequently subject to capital punishment than are the poor and members of minority races. E. Capital punishment eliminates any possibility of rehabilitation and adds the cost of the killer's life to that of his or her victim. 4. There are arguments for the morality of capital punishment. A. It is clearly a deterrent for the killer, who is put to death, but it also deters others who are contemplating murder. B. It is less costly than imprisonment. Critics question this, and there is no reason to make innocent, hard-working taxpayers pay for the upkeep of a guilty killer. C. It puts real teeth into laws, giving them force and sanction and strongly encouraging everyone to obey them. 178. Chapter 9. The taking of human life. D. A person who has killed has forfeited his or her right to be treated ethically. Therefore, taking such a person's life is not immoral. Rehabilitation often is infeasible if not impossible, especially when one is. Study and review on myThinkingLab.com. Exercises for review. 1. What does it mean for something to be logically and empirically prior to something else? 2. Describe the type of approach to moral problems taken in humanitarian ethics. 3. What are your general views on suicide, and why? Do you agree or disagree with the conclusions of Jacques Thirax in Appendix 1? Why? 4. What are your general views on taking a human life in defense of the innocent, self included? Be specific in explaining how and why your views agree or disagree with the views of Thirax as expressed in Appendix 1. 5. Do you consider war to be moral or immoral? Why? If you think it is always immoral, state your reasons. If you think it may be moral sometimes or under certain conditions, describe the conditions and provide reasons that could morally justify war. 6. Is a nuclear war ever justifiable? 7. Before taking on specific issues dealing with capital punishment, it seems that the institution of punishment itself, dealing with serial and mutilating killers, F. It is only fair that killers should pay with their own lives for having taken the lives of others, requires justification. All punishment is intentional. That is, it involves intentionally imposing pain, hardship, and, in the case of capital punishment, even death on another human being. Intentionally doing such things generally constitutes behavior that is deemed unethical or immoral. Discuss possible justifications for the institution of punishment. 8. Do you think that capital punishment is morally justified? Why or why not? If you believe it is sometimes justified, when and when not? 9. Analyze and critically evaluate Thirax's alternative methods, cited in Appendix 1, of dealing with people who have killed other people. Be specific in your criticisms and or support of these alternatives. 10. What possible alternatives to capital punishment would you put forth as a way of dealing with convicted killers? 11. What is terrorism and how does it differ from other kinds of war? 12. Do you think the Iraq War is a just war? Why or why not? Views of the major ethical theories on the taking of human life. In this edition of Ethics Theory and Practice, a section in each of the chapters on applied ethics has been added in reference to how the major ethical theories egoism, utilitarianism, divine command theory, Kant's duty ethics, Rawls's prima facie duties, and virtue ethics might deal with each of the moral issues presented in the chapter. The objective of this edition is to have students and instructors try to logically work out how they think each of the major theories would attempt to solve the problems associated with each moral issue. Instructors could assign this section of the chapter to students, and students could write papers, present speeches, and or debate the questions in panel discussion. Or instructors and students could simply enter into class discussion about any or all of the theories. Because because this is the first chapter dealing with the moral issue, the taking of human life, suggestions as to how each of the theories might deal with this issue in all of its aspects are presented in this chapter. Then in the remaining chapters, instructors and students may do this on their own. The reason for adding this section is that the theories have been discussed in detail in chapters 2 and 3. Students and instructors, if they wish, should try to test them out by applying them to moral issues in chapters 9-16. Suicide. Ethical egoism. Ethical egoists undoubtedly would not be against suicide provided that the person has rationally decided that such an act is truly in his or her own self-interest. Egoists certainly would not accept the idea, however, that others should interfere with a suicide attempt. However, they probably would not be against trying to dissuade the person from committing suicide, if they knew the attempt was going to be made, in order to make sure the person really believed the act to be in his or her own self-interest. The egoist would have no problem condoning the suicides in cases 1 and 2. Utilitarianism. Because utilitarianism believes that one ought to do that act or follow a rule that would bring about the best good consequences for everyone affected by the act or rule, one would have to try to determine whether or not a particular suicide would satisfy the requirements of utilitarianism. It is interesting to speculate if rule utilitarians were to establish a rule for or against suicide. It is improbable that they would establish a rule for it without some qualifications, those having to do with the effect of the suicide on surviving family and friends. For example, suicide could prove to be a real problem for the utilitarian because the consequences might not be good for the survivors, and this would have to be taken into consideration because utilitarianism is concerned with everyone's interest. Utilitarianism probably would condone the action in case 1 because William is dying anyway, and his family seems to be in agreement with his action. It probably would condone Joan's suicide in case 2 because she seems to have no family or friends and considers herself a burden both to herself and others. Still, one would have to know to what extent anyone else would be affected by her action. Divine command theory. What would be moral under this theory would, of course, depend upon which set of divine commands would apply here. Some religions might consider suicide an honorable act, others would not. Christianity, for example, considers suicide to be a moral wrong even though it may or may not condemn a person for committing it. Generally speaking, most forms of Christianity would be against the suicides in cases 1 and 2. Kant's duty ethics. As described in chapter 3, Kant would not be in favor of suicide because it would violate the categorical imperative against killing, including the practical imperative of never using a human being, including oneself, merely as a means to an end. He probably would not accept the suicides in cases 1 and 2, which he undoubtedly would reject. Rawls's prima facie duties. Ross probably would agree with Kant in general but be somewhat more lenient in the application of his prima facie duties. However, suicide would to some extent violate several of the duties beneficence, non-maleficence, and self-improvement mainly because of the effect of the suicide upon survivors, the destruction of human life negating self-improvement, and the possibility of doing harm rather than good to others. Ross might differ with Kant on case 1. He probably would not condone the act in case 2. Virtue ethics. In general, virtue ethics probably would oppose suicide because it stops a person from creating a virtuous character and cannot be considered a moderate act, but rather an extreme one. Virtue ethics would probably accept case 1 as being moral, but probably not case 2, because it would hold that Joan still has the opportunity to create a more fully developed virtuous character. Defense of the innocent. Ethical egoism. Ethical egoists probably would condone this, but only if it were in their best interest. For example, if they had to risk their lives in order to defend the innocent, then they might not be in favor of this. But if in defending the innocent they were also acting in their best interest, for example, if the innocent were themselves, their wives, children, other family, or friends, they probably would be in favor of it. But again, only if it was seen by them to be in their own self-interest would they take action. They probably would condone killing the runaway thief because he has invaded their privacy and attempted to steal their property, which certainly is not in their best interest. They would also condone Mary's action in that she is acting in her own self-interest and self-defense, and the rapist is not. They probably would also condone shooting the sniper because it would be in their self-interest to eliminate such a destructive person who could be threatening their lives and not acting in anyone's self-interest but his own. Utilitarianism. This theory would very likely be in favor of defense of the innocent because this generally is an act in the interest of everyone, and the best good consequences would accrue for everyone from an act or a rule that would encourage such action. They probably would not condone Ed's action in case 1 because everyone's interest is not affected by the boy's action and certainly not the boy's interest. They definitely would go along with the actions in cases 2 and 3, because it would be in everyone's interest to prevent a rapist from committing crimes, and because the rapist certainly is not acting in Mary's interest and because she has a right to protect herself. Utilitarians definitely would see the sniper's death as being in the best interest of everyone affected by his actions because he is jeopardizing the lives of everyone in that area by his actions. The utilitarian might hope that cases 2 and 3 could be resolved without killing, but would probably see that killing is justified in both of them. Divine command theory. Here again, a great deal would depend upon which religion is involved. For example, Jainists or Quakers, who do not believe in the taking of life altogether, probably would not be in favor of killing under any circumstances. Other religions, however, undoubtedly would believe that killing was justified in defense of the innocent, regrettable, but at times necessary. Most probably would not condone the killing in case 1, except those religions based heavily upon retribution. However, in cases 2 and 3, most religions undoubtedly would think the killing was justified, believing that Mary has a right. Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life 179. 180 Chapter 9, The Taking of Human Life. To defend herself against rape and possible murder, and that the sniper was endangering everyone's lives and needed to be stopped before his immoral actions could continue to destroy innocent lives. Kant's duty ethics. Kant, of course, would be against the taking of human life, and certainly would not have justified the actions in case 1, because the thief was unarmed and not threatening Ed's life. He would relent in cases 2 and 3, even though killing was involved. He probably would hope that the situations could be resolved without killing, but if they couldn't be, then he would understand the actions of Mary and the policeman. He might consider the actions to be not fully moral, but he would at least understand why they had to occur and at least partially accept them. Rawls's prima facie duties. Ross also would not condone the killing in case 1, but he would find the actions of Mary and the officer to be in accord with the stronger prima facie duties of justice, beneficence, and non-maleficence. Ross would see their actions as being moral. Virtue ethics. The proponents of this view probably would not accept Ed's action in case 1 as being morally justified because it did not seem to indicate a balance between reason and emotion, prevented the thief from being taught virtue and developing a virtuous character, and exceeded moderation. They would regret the actions in cases 2 and 3 but would probably see Mary and the officer as acting in a virtuous way, as they knew how, under very trying circumstances. On the other hand, they would see the rapist and the sniper as not acting in virtuous ways at all, thus making justifiable whatever actions it might take to stop them from committing their morally wrong acts. War and terrorism. In general, probably probably all of the ethical theories would be against war and terrorism, except under certain circumstances, because they go against almost all of their principles. Ethical egoism. In case 1, this theory probably would condone war in self-defense of the smaller nation. It also might consider the larger nation's actions as being valid in trying to improve its situation by operating in its own self-interest. However, in the long run, ethical egoists might find either nation's actions not to be in its self-interest because of the mass killing and destruction that abounds in war. In case 2, they probably would see the actions of the allies as operating in their own self-interest because the larger nation is trying to destroy all the nations and peoples involved in its aggression. As for the larger nation, this theory might consider that, in the short run, its actions would be in its self-interest, but in the long run might not be, especially if it lost the war it started. Ethical egoists probably would not condone the actions of the two larger nations in case 3 because of their interference in the country's affairs. It is possible that some egoists might say the two larger countries have a right to protect their own self-interests, but their interference in the small nation's affairs seems more immoral. Ethical egoists probably would not condone acts of terrorism because such acts interfere with the self-interest of the victims who have no warning or chance to act in their own self-interest and save themselves. Only the strongest egoists would support the right of the terrorists to act in their own self-interest. Utilitarianism. This theory probably would not condone war because it would not be in the interest of everyone affected. It might condone national self-defense when the war has been started by another nation as in case 1 smaller nation and the allies in case 2. It would not condone the larger nation's actions in either case 1 or 2. Utilitarianism probably would be against interfering in the affairs of the small Far Eastern nation by the two larger powers as not being in the interest of everyone concerned by the actions. Rule utilitarianism probably would have a rule against war except in clear cases of national self-defense. And either form of utilitarianism would be against terrorism as not being in the interest of everyone. Divine command theory. Except for those pacifist religions mentioned earlier or for those condoning holy wars, most religions are against war because of the violence and destruction involved except in defense of an innocent nation being attacked by an aggressor nation. Most probably would go along with the requirements expressed in the Roman Catholic description of a just war except when it comes to nuclear war. Most religions would not condone the larger nation's aggression in cases 1 and 2 but probably would accept the right of self-defense of the smaller nation and the allies. Most religions, except for a few extremist factions within particular religions, are opposed to war except in cases of self-defense. Except for these same extremists, most religions undoubtedly would be against any form of terrorism. Case 3 is hard to describe under this ethical theory because many religions might endorse a war against a godless form of government such as communism, but most religions still would not condone the war in case 3. Kant's duty ethics. Kant, of course, would be against wars and terrorism in general because they violate the categorical and practical imperatives he set forth in his theory because war involves killing and using people merely as a means to an end. He might sympathize with the self-defense theory but still would be against taking lives in general. He might accept the extreme situations of the need for national self-defense in cases 1 and 2 but would feel that such actions are not fully moral. In no way would he condone the actions of the two major powers in case 3 or even the civil war in the Far Eastern country. Ross's prima facie duties. Ross probably would be against war and terrorism because these violate at least 4 of his prima facie duties: justice, beneficence, self-improvement, hard to achieve when one is injured or killed or trying to defend himself or herself all the time, and non-maleficence. He probably would accept defense of the innocent as being justified, but not much else, such as gaining territory. Therefore he probably would accept the self-defense of the smaller nation in case 1 and the allies in case 2, but not the actions of the major powers in case 3 or terrorism in any form or for any reason. Virtue ethics. Just as this theory would accept defense of the innocent, it probably would accept the self-defense of the smaller nation and the allies in cases 1 and 2. It would, however, most likely be against the actions in case 3 and war and terrorism in general as not being moderate and not being conducive to the development of a virtuous character even though it might see some actions of bravery and heroism as being virtuous in themselves. This theory undoubtedly would be against terrorism in any form as not being moderate or virtuous in any respect. Capital punishment. With regard to this issue, the particular cases don't necessarily matter because an ethical theory usually will take a stand for or against capital punishment in general based upon its principles. Therefore, if a person is guilty of a capital crime, the theory will either be for or against execution regardless of particular circumstances. Ethical egoism. Given that there is the alternative of life imprisonment without parole, many egoists would probably not demand capital punishment. Yet some might, unless they themselves were the perpetrators of capital crimes, in which case they probably would deem it to be in their self-interest not to be executed. Some egoists might be for capital punishment in their own self-interest so as to protect themselves against the possibility of such criminals ever escaping to kill again. If they or their families are victims of the killer, they may wish to seek retributive justice, it being in their self-interest to see that he is punished so fully he can never kill again. On the other hand, some might also feel that it would not be in their self-interest to permit social violence that might breed more violence by individuals. Therefore, it is difficult to say exactly what an egoist might accept here. A great deal would depend upon how he has rationalized his self-interest, as we see from the earlier mentioned possibilities. As long as life imprisonment without parole is an alternative, egoists may be against capital punishment. But if they feel it is not in their self-interest to pay taxes to keep a criminal in jail for his lifetime, then they may be for capital punishment. Chapter 9. The Taking of Human Life 181 Utilitarianism. As pointed out earlier in the discussion of the theories of capital punishment, the utilitarian or results theory states that capital punishment should be employed only if it can be shown that the best good consequences will accrue to everyone involved. In other words, if good consequences for everyone cannot be shown to come out of capitally punishing someone, and if there are viable alternatives such as life imprisonment without parole, then capital punishment would not be justified by utilitarians. For example, because studies of the deterrent argument for capital punishment have been shown to be suspect in that there is no conclusive evidence that capital punishment deters crime, the utilitarian probably would be against it. The only aspect of the crime that utilitarians might be concerned about is whether or not the criminal would be let loose in society again, which would not be in the interest of everyone. If it could be guaranteed that he would not be set free, by means of life imprisonment without parole, then they would be against capital punishment. Divine command theory. Depending upon the tenets of a particular religion, capital punishment might or might not be deemed acceptable. If the religion believes in retributive punishment, then it probably would be for it. Believing that humans have a right to judge violators of its commandments and to exact punishment in the name of their god or gods. The more pacifistic religions, of course, would not. Religions that tend to have a stronger theory of mercy and forgiveness would also probably be against capital punishment. Kant's duty ethics. According to Kant, the penal law is a categorical imperative, and woe to him who creeps through the serpent windings of utilitarianism to discover some advantage that may discharge him from from the justice of punishment, or even from the due measure of it. For if justice and righteousness perish, human life would no longer have any value in the world. Whoever has committed murder must die. 8. Kant uncharacteristically approved capital punishment. Ross's prima facie duties. Ross would be in favor of punishment for criminals under his notion of duty of reparation, criminals making up for wrongs they have done, but would probably be against capital punishment because it would violate his duties of beneficence. It would not improve the condition of the criminal as rehabilitation might. Self-improvement. How can the criminal improve himself if he is executed? Non-maleficence. Not injuring others, preventing injury to others could just as well be accomplished by life imprisonment without parole. 182 Chapter 9. The taking of human life. Virtue ethics. Capital punishment certainly would not be a moderate solution for dealing with criminals under virtue ethics, nor would it allow criminals the opportunity to develop a more virtuous character. Therefore, in general terms, virtue ethics would not accept capital punishment. Rather, the virtue ethicist would advocate that we try our best to inculcate virtue into such criminals through education and example. No one who cannot or has not developed such a character, by means of education and training, should be set free from prison. The virtue ethicist would prefer life imprisonment without parole for those unable to profit from virtue ethics training to capital punishment. Reader reactions. Do you agree or disagree with the analyses just presented of what the major ethical views would be, which and why? Support your answers in detail and be sure to include your own analysis of the major ethical theory's views. Ethics problem. Is suicide always wrong? The suicide of Admiral Nimitz. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz Jr. was the son and namesake of the famous World War II naval hero Chester Nimitz. Admiral Nimitz Sr. was victorious in the historic Battle of Midway. In this battle, his naval pilots sunk 4 of the aircraft carriers that led the attack on Pearl Harbor and effectively eliminated Japanese naval power as a major factor in the war. Admiral Nimitz Jr. was also a hero, as a submarine commander. Tragically, his name made headlines years later when he and his wife ended their lives in a double suicide. Reportedly, the Admiral's final statement read, "Our decision was made over a considerable period of time and was not carried out in acute desperation, nor is it the expression of mental illness. We have consciously, rationally, deliberately and of our own free will taken measures to end our lives today because of the physical limitations on our quality of life placed upon us by age, failing vision, osteoporosis, back and painful orthopedic problems." 9. He was 86 and his wife was 89 when they ended their lives with an overdose of sleeping pills. The Nimitzes had made it known at least a decade earlier that when the time came they would control their final days. The Admiral was in constant pain, had lost 30 pounds due to gastrointestinal complications, and was suffering from congestive heart disease. He could no longer drive, and his vision was failing. Nimitz's wife was blind and had no desire to live alone. It was reported that neither believed in God or an afterlife, and they had no religious affiliation. Does old age make suicide ethical? Was Admiral Nimitz justified in his decision to end his own life? Is suicide always wrong? Provide reasons for your point of view. Notes 1. William Morris, ed. The American Heritage Dictionary of the English Language, Boston, Mar Horton Mifflin, 1978, 1287. 2. Daniel Callahan, Abortion Law, Choice and Morality, New York Macmillan, 1970, 417-18. See also Chapter 9. 3. John P. O'Connell, ed. The Catholic Encyclopedia, Holy Bible, Chicago, Isle Catholic Press, 1954, 278-79. 4. Caleb Carr, The Lessons of Terror, New York Random House, 2002. 6. Read the document on Myth in Kinglab, Com 5, Ibid, 12. 6. Igor Primoratz, ed. Terrorism the Philosophical Issues, New York Palgrave Macmillan, 2004, She 7. The Bakersfield, Californian, February 2000, 45. 8. Immanuel Kant, The Science of Right, in the Philosophy of Law, Edinburgh T. and T. Clark, 1887. 9. Buchanan, Patrick J. The Sad Suicide of Admiral Nimitz, WorldNet Daily, January 18, 2002. Against the Death Penalty, Jeffrey H. Riemann.